Well, welcome, Christina, to the podcast. We're so happy to have you.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Christina, you and I spent basically a week together in Nashville last week, and the stories I heard from you and your experience is also fascinating. I actually feel a little bit like, I don't even know where to start with you, but let's start just telling everybody who you are, what you do.
I am Christina Langdon, and now I am a high performance coach. I nurture the next generation of CEOs to help them scale their brain, to scale their businesses. And that was after 30 years of working and leading sales and marketing teams in the media space. I worked for brands like Martha Stewart. I worked for Fast Company, leading teams and talent.
Do we want to just go there, Jenny?
Yeah, let's go there.
Uh-oh, I'm ready, I think.
Okay, 30 years in sales and marketing. What we did, okay, we know you worked with Martha Stewart. Can we just dive right in? What was your role? What did you do? What was it like? Let's just start talking about her.
I worked for Martha Stewart for nearly 20 years. It was
Oh,
about
I didn't know it was that long.
19 years, a little over 19 years. And I started in my middle 20s, and I started in marketing there. And it was
How'd you get the job?
No, it's a really good question. I worked at Time Inc. I worked at Time Magazine, and then I went up to work in Time Inc.'s first corporate marketing division, where they were selling cross titles. And Martha Stewart Living at that time was a Time Inc. publication. And I was struggling in my role because I felt like I wanted to do something different. I wanted to do something that was more purposeful. And this magazine came out. It was on my, desk at Time Inc. And I was like, oh my God, this is so beautiful. So I hand wrote on my personal stationery a note to the publisher and asked if I could have an interview. And he wrote me back a hand note and said no. And I worked with a woman at Time Inc. who was putting together the first $100 million integrated marketing sales program ever sold. It was called Chrysler Rediscover America. That's another story about getting into the Democratic National Convention with Chrysler. But this woman who I worked on executing this very large program with went on to be the publisher of Martha Stewart. So I knocked on her door and said, I tried, and he said no, and I'm going to try again. So I actually went over there, as I said, in my early 20s, and I took a $10,000 pay cut. I can't remember if I was getting paid like 45 and had to go back to $35,000, but it was dramatic. It was a dramatic cut. But I really felt that I wanted to be a part of a mission-driven company that was doing something really different in the marketplace. So I knew early on that there was something there that was really important to me. And you can be sure that I made up for it pretty quickly. So I started in marketing. Go ahead.
What was the mission? Like, just curious, what specifically about Martha's magazine drew you in?
It was really about elevating the art of homekeeping, and that you could turn your passion and turn it into a profit. So I already sort of had the entrepreneurial thoughts running in my head about all the things that she was doing and creating and helping others to see that they could create. So the business angle always was what really inspired me. And early on, we were calling it a lifestyle magazine. And lifestyle at the time, that word wasn't a part of the vernacular. And people would be like, what do you mean? There's no way we're going to create another category for you. But in fact, we ended up creating that new category. So we had the base magazine, Martha Stewart Living. We also had Martha Stewart Weddings. I moved into a sales role as the advertising director at Martha Stewart Kids magazine, which was another beautiful magazine. And I think I tallied it up. I launched about 23 brands off of the base brand while I was there. And I was the associate publisher of the big brand for many years. But I was also publisher of Body and Soul. I was publisher of Everyday Food magazine. And ultimately, we were running a omni media business where we were selling across all of our platforms that included television and radio, digital, merchandising. And I think, like, when you think about integrated marketing, I feel confident saying that a lot of what we did early on was very much trailblazing in terms of advertising and marketing. We were doing integrated marketing before really other people were doing integrated marketing, because we weren't a part of a big media conglomerate. Because at that point, Martha had bought her brand back from Time Inc. She went to Time Inc. and said, I want to do a television show. And they said, I'm sorry, we are in the publishing business. We're not in the broadcast business. And she said, what do I have to do to buy my brand back? And they said $70 million. I think it was, I'm pretty sure it was $70 million. So she went to Kmart, which she had a very small brand of sheets with already, and said, what do I need to do to build my brand out here exclusively at Kmart? And by the way, will you pay me $70 million ahead of time? And they did. And she used that to buy her brand back from Time Inc. It was like a woman doing a really big thing.
Wow. And what year around are we talking?
Okay. It was probably 1998, 1999, 2000s. Yeah. Yeah.
So I honestly, I don't know very much about Martha Stewart or the brand. I, know of her, but it was not something I really followed or read or watched, whatever. But like, how amazing was that to see a woman ask for $70 million? Like, who was she? Like, what was going on? Like, how did she tick?
She's a visionary, and there are a lot of good things. And there's also that kind of counter there of maybe some of the not so good things when you were a woman in business and you're breaking all the rules. And she really didn't care. And she had such incredible belief in herself and belief in her brand. Even when it was a little outrageous. I remember 2 weeks into the job, I was sitting in the ad sales wing of the office. And the office was really small. I think I was like employee number 9 at that time, but we had our own little nook over there. And I was working and everybody else went to lunch. I didn't really know that many people. And Martha came into the nook, and there was a bunch of advertiser premiums, like gifts that we would give to our clients on sales calls. And I heard this very deep voice. What is this? This doesn't look like my brand. This is, and she probably maybe threw in some more aggressive words, right? And she was I sensed that she was looking for somebody. So I peeked my head out and I was like, oh my God, that is her. It's Martha Stewart.
And you hadn't had contact with, because you were in the sales still.
And I said, hi. And she's, did you do this? Pointing to these premiums. And I was like, oh no, I just started 2 weeks ago. And she said, you are going to learn about my brand. What are you doing? And I said, I was hired into this marketing role. And she said, well, then you're going to learn the value of my brand. You're going to learn what my brand stands for. And she turned around and walked away. And that was the end of the conversation. And a week or so later, I got a phone call from her assistant saying that Martha wanted me to shadow an editor, and that I was supposed to meet her at the farmer's market in Union Square in New York City. Well, I had a job. I had like a job that I was doing in marketing. So I had to go to my boss and say, I got this phone call. So I would get these calls often that I was to go meet somebody, or I was to go follow somebody, or I was to join a meeting. And, I've shared, and it's really personal to me, because it was like me going through the Martha University. I really got to know what the brand values were, what the brand stood for, and what her expectations were. And she had some of the highest expectations. Most of the time you didn't meet them. That's how high they were. And good was never good enough. Great was always the goal. And we met it a lot of times, but of course we fell short a lot of the times. So you kind of felt like you were on your heels a lot. But I had the gift of learning ahead of time. So people would say, Martha would be presented something from somebody in the advertising world, and she would say, has Christina looked at it? And my bosses would be like, she works for me. So, but she just relied on me often.
Why you?
Because she put me through this years long understanding of the product, what the product stood for. Like when we would go to a farmer's market looking for a pear to photograph for a cover of the magazine, that pear had to like had to have a lot of colors, like some yellow, some brown, some orange, like multicolor pear. Had to have a beautiful stem that actually had a leaf off of it. And they wanted a certain color for the leaf. So we would be looking for the perfect pear for the cover of a magazine. It wasn't just something that was random. It was very intentional. And they took it really seriously. And it's why I think some of the photography resonated so much. So when you think about two brands like a Better Homes and Gardens in the 90s, and you look at a Martha Stewart, big difference is that you would see this big room at Better Homes and Gardens, a couch with all these pillows. And with Martha, you might see one beautiful pear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh my God. Okay. And so then, so how did you, so did it just sort of happen really naturally like that, that she's like, you, Christina, go do this. You're going to learn my brand. Like, why did she choose you in that moment of that nook?
I've thought about it. I think it was happenstance. I was in the right place at the right time.
Said the thing.
You know, I was the same age as her daughter. And I, you know, when I ultimately left after a 19-year run, that was very, very hard, but also gave me a lot of opportunity. You know, it was time for me to leave, you know, Martha. And in a way, it was time for me to like sort of leave the home.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she was never a mother to me at all, but it was time for me to sort of leave that. So, you know, I think I'm not sure why I got picked at all.
Mm-hmm.
Still, no idea.
That's so fascinating. So then what was your next job from sales? Like, how did, like, people would say, you got to, you know, check with Christina if that pair is good enough, but like, what was the next job for you?
So I went into management. So I was sales director, then I was associate publisher. And I probably was, my first management role was probably as the advertising director of Martha Stewart Kids. And that's when she went to, she was brought up on charges for insider trading. And so I was still early in my career. I was married. I had 3 kids, and I had 3 kids very, very quickly. I had a daughter, and less than 2 years later, I had twins. And soon after that, I was going through a very, very, very horrible divorce.
What year was this?
This was, oh my gosh, 2005.
2005.
Oh, I hope you're not, I hope people aren't checking these dates because I'm close.
Oh no.
Just ballparking is okay.
I just want to know, but I just assumed, I guess I just didn't figure out the dates. I just assumed that your career with Martha Stewart ended with the jail, but no.
Oh no, I was one of the few people that stayed, and I stayed because my personal life was in turmoil. And I had a leadership role in the organization, and it was in a way, you know, more comfortable for me to stay than it was to leave at that point, given the things that were going on in my personal life. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of people left. I mean, we were an organization of like 175, maybe 200 people. And I remember that on the business side, we were about 17 people at one point. That was just on the business side, not on the editorial side. And I remember that same 17 number because there was a January issue of one of the years when she was in jail that we only had 17 advertising pages, and 5 of them were from Kmart.
Wow.
So there was a mass exodus of advertising, and advertisers saying, we will never buy from a felon. We will never buy advertising from a convicted felon. And so most people think she went to jail for insider trading. She did not go to jail for insider trading. She went to jail for lying to the FBI. So she was brought up on charges, and several months later, pretty quick, because we knew that we were going to lose money very, very quickly. So I would say that months later, she goes on trial, and very, very public trial, as you might imagine. And the New York Post, all sorts of media outlets were calling my home because my name was in the magazine. So when you had a home phone at that point, tracking us down, they would look to see who was wearing ID badges and follow us all over New York. We were told to never wear our ID badge. So she was convicted, and she was given the choice to stay out on appeal or go to jail. And she really asked a lot of us, what do you do? Should I go to jail? And
She was asking the staff, like the company?
Yes, she asked people close to her in the company, what is it that she should do? Should she go to jail? And the consensus was, to save the company, she needed to go to jail ahead of her appeal. And she did it. I mean, Martha's a really, really, as I said, very high expectations, very demanding, very clear in her vision. And she definitely had rose-colored glasses. She saw the world through a different lens than I think most people did. But she did what was right for herself, but also what was right for the business. And she went to jail for 8 months.
Did you visit her when she was in prison?
I was on the list, but so I had these young kids, and I just didn't think the right thing for me would be to go at that time. But I wrote to her every week. Because she
wrote
could
wrote a letter?
Hand letters, because she could read letters were accepted,
Wow. So was that entire time that she was in prison, was she sort of like planning her kind of rebirth or reawakening when she got out? Was she strategizing about how to build back her company? Like, what was going on in the mind of this phenomenally gifted entrepreneur?
Well, I can tell you what transpired. I don't really know what was going on in her mind, but yes, we were planning for when she got out, what we'd redo. And they brought in new leadership, and, the story as it unfolds had us back to profitability. It took us 2 years. And there was something about being on this brand that we did love dearly, and believing that it was possible that we could get back to profitability. By making some pretty outrageous decisions and, just going for bold. And she came out and entertained all sorts of people within the advertising community. In part, people wanted to know about her experience. I mean, she could talk about, she never created the cookbook, but she talked about creating a cookbook of how to cook in a microwave, because there was a microwave in the commissary where that she would make things. And she talked about making like caramel and how hard it is to melt in a microwave. But it took us 2 years to get back to profitability. And we did, and we grew and grew and grew. It's really a fascinating comeback story.
So how did the company survive? Did she just have that much cash on hand to survive the loss of all the advertising revenue?
So what's interesting is that it was both an advertising driven brand, but it was also a merchandising
Consumers.
company. So consumers were still wanting Martha Stewart products. There was an inherent value. There was an inherent prestige about them, even if they were sold in Kmart, right? You wanted that Martha Stewart candle. You wanted to set your table like she would set her table. So the merchandising, while it took a hit to a certain degree, the merchandising was keeping us afloat for sure. And when she came out, she was doing a weekly television program before. It aired on Sundays, and it was in syndication. When she came out, she launched her daytime lifestyle show where it appeared every day. It was like, the Kelly Clarkson show that you would see now. It was a lifestyle show where she would cook, she'd entertain. Yes, she'd have stars on, and people wanted to watch her. Her producer was Mark Burnett, who produced Amazing Race,
Yeah,
Survivor, And she did the Martha Stewart Apprentice show as well.
Oh,
Oh,
right.
yeah. I forgot about that. So,
Wow.
but she had, so she just got out and just went for it. Like she must have had people saying like, you're tainted,
Yeah.
like she just kept like, or was it like people were so curious about her that she could get the show, she could get the guests to come on? Like, was it hard to get people
Um,
to?
I think that fans of Martha were always fans of Martha. I mean, there were the Martha fans and then the Martha haters, right? So there was a lot of people rooting for her success, but there was also a lot of people who knew they could make money off of her success,
Mm.
right?
Christina, what would you say are some of the biggest lessons you learned from this experience of working with such a dynamic visionary leader? I mean, obviously 19 years in a role, in a series of roles, working this closely with someone who has so much fame and so much power and so much ambition. Do you have sort of like a collection of lessons or traits or just habits that you can share with our listeners?
Well, I think that there's a few. I mean, Martha told me to learn something new every day and go teach it to somebody else. And that's sort of been like a mantra that I've always lived by. And there's a Mel Robbins, I think it's a Mel Robbins quote where she says, "Go the extra mile because it's never crowded." And I think that she taught me to always think bigger than what's possible and to demand the highest standards, and just have more expectation for setting your own standards. So my personal brand and how I show up, I mean, 19 years, you can imagine that my personal brand has a lot to do with what I learned there. And knowing that she was a bit of a, she was an outlier, she was a trailblazer, and knowing that you were working for a trailblazer, it meant that you could trailblaze. It meant that when the marketplace had never done integrations before, that are thinking about bringing integrations and the concept of integrated marketing into the advertising side of the business, the sales side of the business was possible. And she would, if you fought for something, she would oftentimes, even though she may have questioned it, she'd be like, okay, let's see how it goes.
What was it like to work with her on the TV show? Because you were part of that, right?
I worked on the television show in terms of the advertising that I got for the television show and in terms of the integration that we sold. So when Martha got opened, and this was after she got out of jail, but she got more open to being on a television show and bringing in advertising support. So whether it was creating personalized M&Ms to support the M&Ms brand, she'd select the colors, she'd select the little branding on the M&Ms, M and S for Martha Stewart, and little holiday icons. And we would do packaging around that for M&Ms to help them in their fourth quarter plans. I think I mentioned to you, I had one integration that didn't go as planned. And that was, and this really speaks to Martha and who she is. We did an integration, and I'm not going to name the company name, but it was something that you'd put on your Thanksgiving Day table, and it had a recipe to it. And we had planned for the integration, and it was led by the new CMO of the company. So I'm sure he was the new CMO. I'm sure he really wanted to make a really good impact for his bosses, and it was a family-run organization. And when it came time to film it, we were there in the audience, and Martha talked about the product and then talked about her own recipe for the product. So the gentleman the CMO who I was sitting next to I could feel his heat coming off.
He was in the audience. He was in the audience.
Audience.
She was just talking about the product. Okay.
She talked about the product, and she talked about not how she makes the product better, but how she would do the product. So it did definitely not hit the mark with the advertising team and the CMO. And so at commercial break, this man jumped out of his seat and charged at Martha Stewart. It was really aggressive. It was one of the more aggressive things I remember in my career. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, like this is all my fault too, because I was the one who brought up the integration to her.
Mhm.
And so I remember like kind of getting in between her and this CMO. And it was, and she held herself very, she stood there saying, what can I help you with? And this is when I didn't know that there were security guards, right, all over the place. I didn't realize the securities were packing. And what is the guns? First time. And I was like, oh no, I am in so much trouble. But the interesting thing is I had to walk him out. We had to really physically remove him from the studio. And I remember being on the sidewalk with him saying, how can we make this better? How can we resolve this? Now, I went back upstairs and we knew that we were on East Coast time. So we knew it hadn't aired out on the West Coast. It wasn't going to air
This
on the
was
West
live?
Coast. Oh, it was.
Wow.
So she had to go back on, right? It was live. So she had to go to the next segment. So we knew that we could make some edits before it hit for the West Coast. So that was like check. That was one small problem solved. And she, after the show, left for some reason. And I remember walking back into the studio and she was coming in to the studio in her Suburban, rolled down the window and was like, meet me in my office. And that's not what she said, but she was more aggressive. When I met her in the office thinking that she was going to take me down, right? And be like, I can't believe this is happening. You allowed this to happen. In fact, she said, what was his real problem? And when I explained the problem to her, she said, okay, what are we going to do? And she filmed or it was either a film or an audio recording for their conference with all their dealers. So she went the extra mile, no problem, no question asked, because she wanted to deliver. Inherently, she never wanted to, fall short.
And then
she just
didn't
couldn't
you
help herself. She just couldn't help herself talking about her.
I know how to
her
do
recipes.
this better. Yeah. But you use that re-recorded bit for the different time zones that it played later. Is that correct?
No, we did it. We did that. It was over and above. She went and recorded something
wow.
special for them in their
for them.
conference, right?
Wow.
Couldn't do anything for what it was, but we actually created a commercial for their television monitors in their store. That was over and above as well. We did a lot.
Oh, that's amazing. That's
Mhm.
amazing. So how did it come to an end? When at Martha Stewart, like after 19 years, how did you know it was time to go?
So after 19 years, we have probably been through 5 or 6 years of successive new EVP who reported directly to Martha Stewart, who was running all of sales and marketing. And I was right underneath that. I think I was an SVP. And I think at that time I was publisher. When I left, I think I was publisher of Everyday Food. So this churn had been going on and going on. And one of the biggest regrets I had is before they brought on the last EVP that I worked with, a woman who I'd worked with for a very, very long time left. And so I thought I was going to step into the role. I'd been there for, as we've said, 19 years. And I never asked for it. I assumed, and we know the first 3 letters of assumed, like I just thought and I assumed. And there was a side of me that maybe thought I wasn't ready. And there was a side of me that was dealing with, and I still do today, a ton of imposter syndrome. Could I really do it? Well, I know that I could do it. I could have done it really well. So they bring in this new gentleman. I don't get the role. And so he's always females. He was the first male in that role. And I remember meeting him that first night before he'd been announced. We met him in the conference room and he shared his plans for how he was going to show up the next day. And I offered, how can I support you? What would you like me to do? What do you want my role to be? And he said, just smile.
Oh.
And at that moment, I knew like that was it. And it was okay. And I might have been disappointed and angry and all the things, but I knew that the organization was going to be changed forever. So I did show up and, I did smile, and then I dropped my coffee all over the place. It was one of those kerfuffles where it went up and went over. So I created such noise. So probably a couple of months later, he had a meeting with me, and he would make these hand movements around his face and said, people said, you are the hardest worker. People think you're the hardest worker here. I want to see some of that from you. And it was really, really tough.
Wow.
And I was like, all the signs are saying that it's time. And so one of the previous SVPs or EVPs, one of the previous people in that role, recruited me to go work for her at another company. And as soon as I got the job offer, I took it. And that was sort of the journey of sort of leaving, what had been such a security blanket for me, and a rough 19 years at the same time. But it was time for me to, grow up and sort of launch myself.
So where did you go?
I went to a digital content company that's no longer exists, and they were looking to turn their digital product offering into a storytelling offering. And storytelling is something I had been doing for years. I doubled the deal size in 8 months, and the CEO and the founder of this company asked me to recruit the global president. And I said, sure. They asked me if I knew this woman. I said, yes, I did. And they said, would you help sell her on coming here and taking this role? And it would have been a really big change for her because she had a very big job someplace else. So I spent a couple months recruiting her to take on the role of being my boss. And she accepted. And 4 weeks and 4 meetings later, she fired me.
What?
Oh,
What?
wow.
What?
And now the company doesn't exist anymore.
And now the company does not exist anymore. And so if I was going to give you a lesson from that period,
Wow.
the lesson would be, if you do not believe in your people, trust your people, people are the center of everything. It's always the who, it's not the how. And that company didn't believe in the people. They believed in their digital product more than they did in people. And so the company doesn't exist anymore.
Oh my God. Okay. Fast Company.
So I went to Fast Company as the chief revenue officer, and I had been, at that point, I hadn't subscribed to any more magazines, right? Because everything was going digital, but I always maintained my Fast Company subscription. I just loved the brand. I loved reading it. I loved the stories of founder. I love the stories of creative game changers changing the game. And they were really the first to really feature a lot of women. Like, you were seeing women in roles there. You weren't seeing them anywhere else. So I was a big fan of the brand. And what was interesting is that Fast Company was set up very, very differently from other magazines of its type. The reporting structure of the business side went to the editor. Typically, there was church and state. So two business lines, right? But in this case, everybody reported up to the editor. And it's still owned by Mansueto Ventures. And Mansueto Ventures also owned Inc. magazine. Same case over at Inc. Everybody reported up to the editor. So when I was hired, the company had been on the advertising side, had been struggling for many years, and they had been without a leader for a long time. And the editor said, just come in and do what you can. I trust you, make all the decisions. And I believed him. I took the job thinking that I would be able to, it would be something that I would run, when in fact, when I started making decisions like launching a podcast, what I realized was that there was a church and state that I didn't really fully understand. But my boss felt that podcasts at the time were a passing fancy, and that we shouldn't be investing in that platform when we had to keep our eyes on other platforms. So we know that story and where it goes. They have a podcast now, but I will tell you, I learned that while in that role that I would never work for anybody again.
Mm.
You know, whether it was at
How long
Marcus,
were you there?
probably 2.5 years.
Oh, okay.
I learned that I wanted to make my own decisions, that I wanted to trust myself to make decisions and to make game-changing decisions. Because even working for Martha Stewart, I had really not been given the opportunity to invest in things that I know would have made a really, really big difference. So I started my own company. I'll keep going with Fast Company. So Fast Company, both Inc. and Fast Company were struggling with the advertising side. And so there was the two editors were vying for a larger role, and the Inc. editor won out. And so they got rid of my boss and they got rid of me, and combined the advertising and sales together, and sort of got rid of the management. So I say I was sort of exiled. And I while I was upset, as you can imagine, I'd met Cher, right? I had done like one week-long event that dropped $1 million of profit to the bottom line. Like, I did some pretty amazing things, but there was, I had been hearing whispers that something wasn't right, that I really wasn't that happy. And here I was as the CRO. It's what people expected of me. Like, I'd hit the C-suite. And I kind of thought it would be easier there. And I kind of thought that the whispers and nudges would go away, and they did not. So what was it that I really wanted to do? And I know people had expectations of me, like that I would go on maybe to be a CRO someplace else. And I also had those expectations of myself as well. But I could tell that the media business was no longer the place. That's not where I really wanted to be. And somebody who had worked for me at Fast Company, who had been out of work for some time, she had an accident. She had an accident while working, so she was on workman's compensation. She called me and said, "You are the first person I'm calling since my recovery." And it had been many, many, many months. And she said, "I want to let you know that you changed my life, both personally and professionally. And I think you should be a coach."
Mm.
And it was so funny, working for Martha Stewart, we didn't have a big HR department a lot of the time. And there wasn't any development. And I was a new manager, and I was going through crisis after crisis after crisis. So on any given lunch hour, you could find me at the Barnes and Noble, like on the floor of the self-help aisle. Like, I did a lot of work early on in my career to do the work on myself, and also to do the work on my leadership and how I was going to lead myself to lead others with more impact. So when she said, "Why don't you be a coach?" Well, I thought that I had a lot of judgment around coaches, right? And I thought others would have judgment around coaches. But there was this sort of ignition. I said, "I'm going to do this." So I held my first workshop, Lead Your Extraordinary Life, with these women that were amazing. And I really found, like, when I was in it, I felt like this was what I was meant to do. And less than 24 hours later, I wasn't feeling well. So I was like on a high, but also not feeling well. And I remember coming home and getting a blood test taken. And in a short while later, like 24 hours, I was put into the hospital for the first of, I think I was there for 36 days. The first round I went into the hospital, but I was diagnosed with AML leukemia. And I was robbed. Like, I really was like, "Oh, come on." I mean, I was scared and everything, but I also was like, I finally figured out what I wanted to do after all this time, and now it's been taken away from me. And a lot of that was probably a survival tactic, right? A lot of that was part of I call it my post-traumatic growth episode, the year-long of treatment. But Dr. Park, I went into the emergency room that night, and Dr. Park, a lot of the doctors were coming in asking the same questions over and over and over again. And Dr. Park came in, he was reading my blood test, asking many of the same questions. And then he gave me like a life-saving thought. It changed my whole world. because my family was there. One of my children was there, and my best friends were there, and everybody was looking at me like I was going to die. And Dr. Park said, you don't come to MSK, Memorial Sloan Kettering. You don't come to Memorial Sloan Kettering to be treated. You come to be cured. And I remember like looking at my family being like, okay, game on, like we're going to do this. And in that moment, I was like, okay, what's really possible for me? And is it possible I could build a thriving and growing coaching and consultancy business? Is it possible that I could write a book? Is it possible that I could put myself into a certification program? Is it possible? And so I was like, hey, why not? And so again, in part because I'm not pounding my chest, it was definitely a survival tactic, but it kept me going. And so I launched when I was feeling towards the end of my treatment, when I was feeling better, I launched a 30-day challenge with kind of people a little bit outside of my network, just like one rung outside of my network. And that's how my coaching business started.
Oh my God. I don't even know where to start. Okay, first of all, that's just amazing. I also have, as you know, was diagnosed with cancer back when I was 29, 30. So I know that feeling, and it's just, I understand like the looks that you get and the discomfort, even with the word, like they wouldn't want to talk about it. And it equals death. And it's just like, but you know what? I kind of feel okay. And like, let's go. So I love the story that you sort of had the concept of the idea of your business while you were being treated for cancer.
Yeah, and I walked around with my computer, and people were like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm writing my book."
Starting a business. Oh, you started
I
writing
was writing my book, starting a business, and I was like, "We got to go." But yeah, sort of the boulder of cancer is just another chapter of, it's just a whole new dimension. And I am very close to hitting my 4 years, I think, out. And that'll be a huge marker for me.
And what is it like to run your business now? What does that feel like?
Oh, well, just like everything. Some days are good, some days are bad, but I am so much more joyful. I mean, when you think about the joy, right? I have so many more joyful days now than I ever had. And I kind of want to share that, we are raised to think like, you got to go to college, you got to get a great job, you got to find your one true soulmate, right? Got to have your children, and we have all these goals. And then women, we get into this sort of midlife and we question, like, is this it? And so I got to answer that, like, no, that this isn't it. And I can create my own it. I can create my own life script. My mother used to always say that to me, you write your own life script. And so I've got like the back half of my life to live. And I want to, I talk about in the book For Success Sake, I talk about my process of defining success. And we know success isn't money and it's not things. Although when you're successful, you have money and things, right? But success to me was really about being successful, F-U-L-L, successful with an extra L, full of more joy, ease, and impact. Well, what does it look like to be more joyful? And I ask myself, that's like a filter I have in my business every single day. It's how do I create more impact? Well, will that impact bring me joy? Because if it doesn't, that may not be the impact I want to make. And what does ease look like? That ease for me is a kind of a hard thing. I'm not really easy. I don't, I'm a high performance coach. Like sometimes I make things harder than they need to be. So reminding myself of the ease, like if this could be easy, what would it look like? So what it looks like to run my business every day is I get to work with visionary leaders, and I work with some of the most amazing leaders, and all leaders, yourself, your beautiful selves included here, we kind of are all more alike than we know. And I think once we realize, being a CEO, leading companies today, it can be so incredibly lonely. And there's imposter syndrome, and there's waxing and waning of confidence, and there's sometimes doubt, and it's lonely. So I get to work with visionary CEOs as their thought partner. I get to, help them see what they can't see. I help them see what they can see a little bit more clearly. And I am working with a company right now, and I've been blessed to be given the opportunity of sharing this with you, that the company's called Her MD, and it's a company that's changing women's healthcare. And they are changing women's health in midlife and perimenopause and menopause. And for me, coming out of cancer, a year of cancer treatment with all those chemicals, it just wreaked havoc on my body. And I didn't have a Her MD to go to say, here are all my symptoms and what can we do about it? Instead, my OBGYN told me to grin and bear it.
Mm.
Oh. So, people with visions, just like yourselves and the beautiful work you do, sometimes when we have a vision, it can be really hard because we're breaking down the system. Her MD is breaking down the system of healthcare. It's breaking down the system of women's healthcare, takes a back seat to men's healthcare, right? And it can be really hard. And if I want every visionary leader to have a co-partner, to have a co-pilot, a thinker, to help them have a landing, have a net for when the days feel so hard.
Christina, can I ask you what that looks like? I'm so curious what it would be. I mean, what an amazing business you've created for yourself to have interactions with CEOs and to get to have to be the listener in their lives. And I'm just wondering, as a CEO, things happen erratically and unexpectedly. And so what does that container look like for your coaching clients? How do they have access to you? How do you communicate with them? I'm so curious how you've shaped that program or that product.
Yeah, I have a strong belief that the best thing for visionary CEOs is to have a meeting with me once a week. And there is a plan and there's sort of a curriculum that we follow. But I also work with their leadership teams. And I also work with their entire organizations. And they bring me in when they're trying to create new possibilities where they feel like they need support. So it's sort of a little bit of a surround sound. Sometimes I'm just working with the CEO one-on-one, and sometimes I'm like a little bit of a secret agent, like they don't want anybody to know. But more often than not, people actually bring me in to help them throughout the organization. But it can be a lot on trusting. It can be a lot on defining like who you are as the CEO, because we have to remember, we as the CEO are different than our personal identity and our self-worth. So when we are leading these visionary companies, we become a part of it, right? And we have to remember that, yes, that is your blood, sweat, and tears, but it doesn't mean anything about your self-worth. Your self-worth is very, very much standalone. So what is the relationship they want to have with the CEO of themselves? And when they're struggling with decisions, it's helping them, let's make this decision. Are we making it today from the CEO chair, or are we making it from the visionary chair? Right? And seeing which is really best for the business. And then also, oftentimes, when you're scaling these types of companies, it's important to sort of help them see who is the CEO they want to be 12 months, 3 years from now. And saying, okay, if you were making that decision 3 years out, how would it impact how you show up today? So really getting them to think, Dr. Benjamin Hardy says, Dan Sullivan says, your future, the bigger your future is, the better your decisions today.
That's so cool. And your clients, they run some big companies. Like multi millions of dollar kind of companies, right?
Well, I coach a lot of different companies, but I do coach some big companies. And the bigger the company, the bigger the risk, and the bigger their visions have to be and grow, it gets harder. The bigger they get, it gets harder. I'm a big proponent in possibilities, and what happens when we get bigger, we tend to fall into, okay, how are businesses typically run, right? And like strategic planning. We do strategic planning from looking back at the past to create the future, which means you're really creating more of the same, or you're creating increments of improvement different off of what's established. And so sometimes visionary leaders can fall into sort of standard ways of thinking. And so I help CEOs of bigger companies think about, what if we never did things the same way that we do them now? Like, what are we tolerating that we no longer want to tolerate? And what if we could decide on our future and then reverse engineering it? And we do it through a series of questions that are really unbusiness related, that oftentimes get underneath some of the real problems that are really getting into the way of their growth.
Very relatable.
Jenny. I didn't tell her to say that, Jenny, or anything. I didn't.
Now I have to think about what I just said.
I know. We can talk later.
So I'll just follow that up with, oftentimes when I talk about the possibilities and future thinking, people say, well, we're constrained because of lack of budget, or restrained because of lack of people. And I remind people of just a couple of years ago what the constraint was, when CEOs of Google and Microsoft, all these hundreds of thousands, Ford, were hundreds of thousands of employees, when you told that CEO that they had to move their employees home in a matter of days, and that you didn't know when they would come back again, like they would have been like, no possible way. Well, in fact, from constraint, they had to say, well, what's possible? And they had to get to, well, we must. And when you think about the vaccines, whether you're for them or against them, typically it takes 9 to 12 years to create a vaccine. And the CEOs of the pharmaceutical companies were told they needed to do it in 9 months. So think about what they had to change in their thinking to really sort of tear down a process of 9 to 12 years to recreate it for 9 months.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's so good. So good. Well, Jenny.
All right, Christina. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. Hopefully we will be able to have you back on the podcast to have a follow-up conversation, because I think that having you share some more of your coaching techniques and strategies would be incredibly useful for not only us selfishly, but also some of our listeners. But before we go, I would love to ask you to share something that's bringing you joy in your life right now, and a tool that our listeners can use to help them hustle in their career or business.
The joy would be maybe an expected answer, but I am blessed to have 3 children. I have a daughter, Caroline, and I have twin boys, Jack and Teddy. And I've raised my kids primarily by myself for about 16 years. And they have all successfully graduated and are working in the city, so not too far from me. So the joy I get is seeing my children become, the individuals I'd always hoped that they would become. I mean, I know it sounds pretty a typical answer, but it really does give me the most joy. And then the hustle, it's really simple. I use on a Mac computer, and the notes app on my Mac computer, I have up on my phone, I have up on my computer at all times. I take notes all day long. I don't wait to journal. If I have a thought that I want to journal on, I can just put it right there in my notes. And if you can think about your notes as like sort of your best friend that you can always rely on to like dump on, that's how I use my notes section. And if you've read my hundreds of notes, that would probably tell you a lot about me. But that's where I get the most creative. When I'm out on a walk, I have a thought, it just goes into my notes.
Yeah, that's good. I don't think anyone's ever said that, like the notes. So
on the podcast.
Good.
No, it's great. I use them too prolifically, and I agree with you.
Prolifically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Well, this has been
So-
an absolute pleasure. And
Yeah.
what's
you
giving
see?
me joy right now is having spent this time with you ladies. I really appreciate it.
Well, tell everyone where they can learn more about you and maybe even a little plug for your book.
Oh, so you can learn more about me at ChristinaLangdon.com. I publish the Sunday Sunshine, which is a newsletter every Sunday in front of the work week, so that you don't have to have the Sunday scaries, that you can just dive in and have a bit of motivation and maybe a new thought to start off the work week. So you can subscribe there. And then I wrote a book. It's called For Success Sake, Easy Steps to Living an Extraordinary Life. And you can buy that on Amazon.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Christina.
You're welcome. It was so nice to see you.
All right.